microphone. Thank you. For joining us. Before I make any kind of formal remarks, I do want to explain that I convey to each of you a very warm and sincere greeting from Karen, my wife, who unfortunately could not be here. And there is a reason, some of you know, why she isn't here. Karen and Jonathan, who's now 6.5 years old, spent the summer, all summer in Poland. And the result of their shopping around in Poland, we have gone from a family of one child to 3 children. We have adopted 2 15-month-old children in Białystok, Poland, whose names will be Jesse.
To the group, it's a pleasure to have you here, and I hope that you'll find in the next several days that you'll not only appreciate the meetings that you have with each other, which is the main purpose of this, but we'll take the opportunity to get to know a little bit of this part of the world. We have a very special guest tomorrow, Minister Mousson from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who's also the mayor of Annecy, and he and I constitute quite a booster group for the region of Haute-Savoie. So I hope for many of you this will be perhaps your second time in Haute-Savoie, but not the last. As John mentioned this afternoon during the reception, to which you and your spouses are cordially invited, and your children in the case of Mr. Zibet, we will be very happy to show you this building from a historic point of view, and suffice it to say that we have interests in the history of it beyond what we might.
Much earlier to move the whole process of working on papers forward so that most of the papers drafts were ready this year by middle of March at the latest with the last one, and some of the discussions began in February. I was also able, because of that, to arrange various seminars at places like Brookings and the Center for Strategic Studies at Georgetown on the basis of papers, and that made a big difference. So you could have a paper, as we did on conventional arms control, presented to a group of outside specialists from Brookings and a number of the other institutes in Washington. And that is important, however, that the person be able to present an actual draft. And that meant, in fact, by April, when these things were done, that you had had papers put forward on, that had already gone through 2 or 3 drafts. We also had a number of people listening to the RAND Corporation and established contact with them.
The nature of relations, not only between East and West, between West and West, between East and East. And I think that we all have to recognize the fact that something is happening significant. Mr. Gorbachev and what's happening in the Soviet Union is significant. Some of the things that are happening in Eastern Europe, the American presidential election, and the beginning of a debate in the United States as to what kind of relationship we want with the Soviet Union is worth looking at. The global economic situation, the fact that the role of the United States and the Soviet Union in world affairs is not the same and will not be the same 10 years from now as it was during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. What does that mean? The whole question of the INF agreements, the fact that we're now talking arms reduction, not arms control. I think all of these factors are extremely important, and I personally firmly believe that this is a great opportunity and a great moment when we have to come forward with new ideas. Flora Lewis wrote very fairly an article after the Helsinki conference that she attended, where she pointed out a number of interesting things, but the most important being that there were no new ideas at that conference. And I think, and that hit home, and it was a fair summary of what was, I think, a good conference overall, but in terms of intellectually, there were no new ideas. And I think that the time has come when groups like ours, and in fact, we should pass out, I don't know if all of you saw Flora's article, we should actually get it and pass it out at this conference, because I think it's worth reading. That this is really, it is a time when, unlike the 60s or 70s or even 3 years ago, when you were fellows, that there's an awful lot that could change, and an awful lot that should change, I would add, in the nature of the relationship between East and West. And I think this is something which hopefully this conference, this meeting, or let's call it a conference, hopefully will contribute to. And I hope that at the end of these 3 days, we might provide Flora with something where she could say something contrary to what she said after Finland. But with that being said, I just want to set the theme that I think that we're in a very important period, and I think we have a responsibility as one of the major academic institutions in this field, of taking a leadership role in this. And I intend to speak out much more forcefully on the issues in the future, and I hope that all of us do, and we contribute something. With that in mind, let's turn over to
Well, as you said, we just it's a very significant moment for Israel relations, and I think we can have a standing ground for openness. In the dialogue between the United States and the Soviet Union on arms control has been intensified, and there are more favorable perspectives as regards an agreement on Soviet and United States long and short range. As a European, I'm looking forward that the two superpowers will persist in their search for agreement in those areas between negotiation where common ground exists, and particularly the prospect of an early agreement on a carbon zero solution for the global elimination of long and short range. May I also recall the objective reached in Reykjavik on reducing the strategic altitude of another development, which I think is one of the good moments of this negotiation, is that whenever progress was to be made, the necessary degree of confidentiality during the Geneva negotiation has been shown. I feel that this is very important and should be taken into account in the future. I remember, from 1981 and 1982, when similar negotiations failed because this factor of confidentiality has not been always domestic political stability. We didn't have any problem. And the recognition of the importance of peace and security in the Mediterranean, because this problem goes also with terrorism. It's a matter we have discussed, as you mentioned, last year in New York, but it might increase again, so we must have this in mind. And the other problem is the economic growth and the security.
Very important. It was the beginning of something, but we don't know yet. We don't know what. There have been some small steps, and even if we have a summit and a treaty this year, we have to see that as a relatively small step. But they do mark a point of important change. I think the divisions in the Western response have been very largely exaggerated. On one side, people claiming there has already been a transformation of the Soviet Union, that everything has changed, Cold War is practically over. On the other side, wearing blinkers and earmuffs and pretending nothing at all has happened, but an improvement in Soviet propaganda capacity. Furthermore, some Americans profess to be very disturbed by European polls showing that Gorbachev has become more popular than Mr. Reagan, and he is perceived as a more eager peacemaker. And I think it's very important to reject all this nonsense. This is not a beauty contest. We're talking about the effort by Gorbachev to install reforms in his country is not a trick to dazzle the West. We must try to persuade people, and this is certainly to an important extent job of the media, to keep their eye on the fundamentals, on the basic issues, and not be carried away by the showbiz aspect. Obviously, Mr. Gorbachev is pushing for reform because he sees things have gone wrong in the Soviet Union. That is not something to be upsetting to the West. There have two major points. There have been bad internal results. And the second point is that the inspirational appeal to the rest of the world, which Soviet leaders used to consider their Marxist birthright, and has very largely disappeared. And Soviet officials, including Mr. Gorbachev, have said openly and repeatedly that they want change because they feel their country's hard-won status as a superpower is endangered if they don't. So this is a matter of foreign as well as domestic policy. But we really can't predict the implications yet, and I think it's a mistake to go rushing off into the uncertain future. What we need to do is analyze the reasons for the way the change in direction and the way things are changing, and analyze the possibilities, not try to jump far ahead and say, here we are. What the West can do about this, to the extent that it is providing the Soviet Union with an enhanced appeal, is to improve its own policies in order to maintain support of its own people and attend to its own social and economic flaws, so that in this new round of competition, which Gorbachev would like to develop, but that he succeeds in not there is a vigorous Western place. It's important, I think, to see that the Soviet failures in the past were not American successes, and Soviet successes in the future will not be American or Western failures, so long as the West learns to look after its own needs. And people everywhere will benefit, which I think is the basic reason to be optimistic and hopeful at this time. Mr. Gorbachev has acknowledged what I think we all know in our bones, that people everywhere are yearning for candor, for a good conscience, for a safer, more humane world. There are still very great differences between the two sides on how to get there. And a very important transformation will be inevitable. It is one that will require great prudence and caution because we are stepping into a really unknown new era. But we can begin to think ahead about how it might be possible to end the Cold War, what kind of measures are necessary, where movement needs to come. There are already a good number of arguments, particularly in the West, for ending the alliances. And I think that is premature and dangerous. And I have found in talking to Soviet officials, so do they. That is not the public official one. The alliances remain important to managing this transition to a new kind of European order. And the essential requirement, it seems to me, remains a change in Soviet relations with the countries of Eastern Europe. If that should develop so that there is more confidence within the East, that would make it possible for there to be a good deal more confidence in the West and to approach the end of the partition of Europe. One last point, I cannot avoid saying that I quite disagree with Ambassador Stepanov on this issue of confidentiality versus public diplomacy. And I'd like to point out to begin with, confidentiality has nothing to do with confidence or trust. It simply means keeping secrets in diplomacy. And I simply cannot subscribe to his view that the INF negotiations, the arms control negotiations, broke down in 81 because of too much publicity. On the contrary, those negotiations were conducted with a great deal more secrecy than we have had in the last 6 months to a year. Now, there's an enormous change. I was a newspaper woman, very conscious of it. It used to be, there was no way you could learn anything about the negotiations except by going to Washington. In Geneva, people wouldn't talk to you at all. And that broke down to a bed and talked to you in Geneva. I was scolded, David Gass, very severely just last year because I used a Geneva dateline. He said, you should have put a Paris dateline, because otherwise we'll be accused of talking in Geneva. Now, I was recently in Moscow, the head of the Soviet delegation said, why don't you come see me in Geneva? We can talk about these things. There really has been a change in the atmosphere towards more openness, and I don't see that as a handicap or a deterioration in negotiations. On the contrary, it seems to me that they are working better, that the openness reflects a greater desire to make them. Thank you.
What developed during this last year, that is to say, expectation toward the summit and toward an INF agreement. open focus is no longer on SDI. And one of the points we could analyze would be how the two matters remain related in fact in the diplomacy of the Soviet Union. This question of INF agreement and of summit raises a number of questions. First, how does the summit momentum between the two superpowers work with regard to other powers? Second, is the real improvement in East-West relations only identifiable to progress in arms control? That is to say, does the main impulse come from the possibility of an arms control agreement? Or is it only one sign among others reflecting this improvement? Third, can stability and security be really improved by such an agreement without regard to the important fields of international relations? Fourth, do changes in the diplomatic style of USSR reflect deeper and long-lasting reflections? Fifth, which place remains for other actors, especially Europe, which aren't considered as a passive stake? I should like only to try to give some other questions or reflection about two other aspects covered by these questions. First, the paradoxal effects and aspects of the summit momentum. And second, what could be the meaning, or what is the meaning of the new détente advocated by the USSR? The paradoxal aspect of the summit momentum, or does the present course of arms control between the two superpowers announce greater stability and security? Paradoxal aspect can be noted. First, after having strongly argued for the necessity for the SS-20 for its own defense, USSR accepted zero option and gave progressively many hindrances it discussed set up. And this raises the question of what is really the objective, the main objective for USSR now? Is it still SDI through an indirect way in arms control, or is it Europe through a more political way, as USSR announces it more clearly, or is it both? What one can say at first glance is that SDI worked positively for the INF agreement because it helped by its pressure pushing the USSR to come back to Geneva, and then for the summit, two summits that happened, maybe the third one. And also it focused on the technological challenge. And so maybe for USSR, INF agreement was a good way it found in the last months. The second paradoxal aspect is the importance of internal aspects for both superpowers, both for President Reagan, who through this agreement can appear as the first president who signed the real division agreement, and also for Gorbachev, who can prove sincere desire of peace, although he's the only one to get a real military advantage in this agreement. And it is one also of this paradoxal effect, which was also tackled through the question of confidentiality. It is the presence of public opinion mainly since the employment pattern of 1983, which can be avoided. Let me now list some paradoxal effects of the INF investigation. The first one would be that arms control seems really, for the time being, to have become the central question in East-West relations. Whatever was said with insistence in the US with regard to the importance of human rights and regional conflicts, and also in the 80s, it seems to be the leading component of East-West relations, whereas it was in the past more a test of East-West relations. At the same time, when it becomes in the real central place in the East-West relation, arms control seems to become less rigorous, and that leads me to the second paradox, which is the twist evolution and verification between USSR and the US. The third paradox would be the convergence of anti-nuclear rhetorics on which this coming agreement is relying to a certain extent. And the fourth one is that it responds to what I should call a reversed logic. With regard to security worries. The fact is that INF represents a very marginal proportion of nuclear systems. 7% of strategic, 7% about among strategic weapons, 4% of all nuclear weapons. Substitution is very easy for the Soviet Union, with systems able to reach Western Europe too, such as the SS-25. Another point from this point of view is that INF can be considered as the most stabilizing systems, especially for European. And for instance, France considers that the real priority would be balanced, substantial, and verifiable cuts in strategic weapons. And another point from this point of view of the logic of INF agreement is that one forgets now often that the double track decisions was not only a response to the deployment of SS-20, but it was also an internal necessity for deterrence within the alliance, given the strategic parity between the two superpowers. I think I'm a bit too long, and I just give some points on the other aspects. That is to say, the new détente. Can we expect from this possible agreement something really which leads to optimism with regard to this new détente? For Europe, we can consider that also through this agreement uses time against SDI, knowing that the Congress support can erode along with the months. And also, both superpowers use the time by improving their strategic arsenals, strategic weapons. So the question would be, is not this agreement mainly meeting point between opportunity requirements from both sides? Indirectly, we assist also in parallel to a kind of perversion in arms control, but in more especially in the Helsinki process. In the developments of this year shows reinforce some elements about both the Soviet Union conception of the Helsinki process, for which security is some part of the world, and alliances are the preferred dialoguing actor. On the other hand, it appeared from the American point of view that the Helsinki process deals mainly with human rights and is not, doesn't seem to be serious enough to fully incorporate the security dimension. Although the most European countries, as France for instance, consider the necessity for a balanced approach of East-West relations, in which security is one aspect, one important aspect, which is not in the center and not in the margin in East-West relations. And to conclude, and I should have tackled with other aspects of my paper, which because I took too much time on these points. I should say that the last year underlined converging elements between USSR and USA on numerous points, which are also importance of internal questions. The connivence in regional crisis, the high priority to disarmament in Europe, the high priority on bilateralism, and this bilateralism still remain based on the strategic priority, and also prevention with regard to everyone who can trouble the tête-à-tête. One thing is sure also is that Europe remains the main or one of the main states in East-West relation. And to finish, two questions. The attractive new style of Soviet leader, the new style in the more mobile Soviet diplomacy, the ability to use the concepts, language of Westerns will be compensated in the West by the same ability to adaptation. And another question is what is now how is evolving deterrence, the concept of deterrence both in the West with all the questions around flexible response and other deterrence strategies, and in the East where some confusing vehicles are produced now about rehabilitation or deterrence or the. Thank you very much. Apologize for
This I'm going to change. I must say that I have to add this element of anxiety also, because once you are in a change, you are never sure what would be the final result. You need much more than ever the more stable, you require much more than ever stable and peaceful environment. This environment is not fully like that. I think that all of us, we would agree probably that there is a new momentum in East-West relations. There is a clarification and improvement of US-Soviet relations. There is new dynamism in the field of disarmament. Some traditional approach to arms control and disarmament became subject of heavy criticism as not being responsive to new conditions. There is a new intensity of a political dialogue, which means also some improvement of communication. Although I would not exaggerate too much in this particular case, I think that some in the East, trying to get a little bit more perhaps than might expect at the moment, while the East is perhaps not fully able yet to translate the new ideas into the concrete elements of new decisions, new common decisions, so to say. It's not easy, this process for the East to meet. Now, when meeting the Western partners at the table, I'm usually told, or we are told in Poland, in a somewhat triumphal voice, well, everything what is going now is due to the Western policy of strength. It brings the results and so on. Fortunately, this is the idea which we cannot accept, and not because of any ideological reasons, just for two reasons at least. First of all, we think that the new momentum is related mainly to the policies pursued by the Gorbachev's leadership, and I will say a few words what I have in mind. And the second is that not only the Gorbachev's policy, in fact, I think that more than ever, the East-West relations are under the influence of home events, especially in the Soviet Union and in the United States, the approaching elections in the United States. Also in other countries, especially I have in mind the Eastern Europe, which is undergoing a profound process of change, to which a very exact, so to say, solution has not yet been found. I don't think, perhaps with one solution in Hungary it will be clear, but otherwise not yet fully found. Even in Poland we are still under a kind of development, trying to find a proper way of a change which I have in mind modernization in general. Well, what do I have in mind the new policies of the Soviet Union? I have in mind, first of all, new emphasis of mutual dependency and common interests, which mean more efficient adaptation of Soviet interests to those of the international community. Then giving priority to internal needs of modernization, which involves or is related to also new approach to human rights. Now, it is the readiness to explore new solutions in military field, in the security field. There is new atmosphere, for example, I would say, for reconsideration of, for example, problem of surprise attack capability, which is expressed in the proposals of the mutual discussion of the military doctrines, of military concepts, to which also I think the so-called Jaruzelski plan, which I'm saying so-called because it has official other name, the plan on decreased armaments and increased confidence in Central Europe, is also related, because I think that this is also a plan aimed at finding a new possibility of decreasing, of removing the possibility of any kind of military conflict in Central Europe, and especially in the case of surprise attack, and limit on both sides those possibilities. Of course, I cannot develop that subject more at this moment. Then there is also an evaluation of intra-bloc relations, not only in economic field, some other too. At the moment one feels the atmosphere, this is the process, this is not always immediate, so to say, result, but it should start with something. And I feel, at least, that it is starting. Now, there are definitely threats to East-West relations related with this new situation. There are challenges for the West, and there are challenges for the East. The previous speakers referred already to some challenges to the West. I think perhaps I would add also the problem that the concept of the so-called flexible response has been, and on the role of U.S. nuclear forces, has been put to some extent under, not questioned, but under a certain, so to say, under a discussion at least. Now, the role of conventional forces has also been put under certain question. Then we hear the voices in the West which we are not happy with on the new necessity of measures of compensation in conventional field in case the INF is concluded. I will refer to this later on. Now the challenges for the East. The challenges of the East is first of all to secure a peaceful path of the modernization process. This is different almost in every Eastern Bloc country, whatever it is called. There are some similarities. Similarity is the need of modernization, but the way is slightly different. Then another one is the problem to preserve basic cohesion at the moment of certain revaluation of national interests. I think that there is, at the moment, very significant element which will influence also East-West relations, that the Eastern Bloc countries are trying to be more sober and trying to better evaluate their own interests. They are thinking less perhaps now than in the West in the terms only of a bloc. I think NATO is speaking more perhaps than Warsaw Pact in this term. This might have also a destabilization effect later on, but that's another question. Then another challenge, the third one, is to keep basic control over indispensable increased influence of external factors on domestic process. Because now, because of many reasons, not only because of general mutual interdependency, but also because of the need of the Eastern Bloc countries to get more technology and so on, there will be an increased influence. And the problem is how to keep control over it on various other fields. So I would say that the vulnerability of the East is also, at least a passive vulnerability, temporary, is a certain problem which has to be, cannot be completely overlooked. So what are the dangers looming on the horizon, I think? First of all, looking also from the Polish point of view, I'm speaking more, if there is a success in the limitation of a nuclear arms race, I have in mind especially INF agreement, then ironically we might be faced with a new conventional arms race, which unfortunately might be, so to say, might be caused, not caused, might be, might come rather from the West than from the East. because of the still perceptions of the so-called Soviet threat and so on, then we might be faced with this conventional arms race, which would be very dangerous from every point of view: security, economy, and political, and so on. Then what I think is also dangerous, it might be the deepening gap between the two parts of Europe in the economic field. Because we are speaking that the political dialogue improves, that this improves and that, but let's face the facts. The improvement in economic field is not a very big one, and if you look at the Vienna CSC meeting, one would notice that there are no clear ideas what to do with East-West economic relations. The best idea is to call the conference, again a new conference or a forum. By the way, I must say that sometimes I'm sorry to read in some papers that, for example, only the idea of only the Western idea of a meeting is to be shown as a kind of a constructive approach to be met. But there is also a similar Eastern idea, absolutely similar, and it's never mentioned, so to say. Well, and this also the problem, how another danger, how the process of whether the modernization in Eastern Europe would go in a peaceful way or would produce some instability, temporary instability, which cannot be excluded. And then there is another question which I will only point out to, that is the new elements in the so-called German question, which we cannot also forget about it. I don't want to dwell at this very moment, but with the new development, that is also a certain problem which exists, so to say, and we hope that this problem will evolve in accordance with the general agreements we have concluded in Helsinki in '75. That is the basic idea which I wanted to express. To conclude with, I would say that what we need is to now to concentrate in East-West dialogue on the common security through cooperation. I fully agree that ending of alliances would be a completely premature idea at the moment even to discuss, for various reasons. Now, another task is the prevention of a new conventional build-up. That would be really something of dramatic change in Europe, because this would produce really the deterioration of relations. And here the Polish plan might be of some help, perhaps, because it is aimed at restructuring, at producing new defensive structures in the conventional field. Of course, among other, I would develop also. I would also say that what is needed should be also more restraint on the West towards the process of modernization in the East, because I think that very often I think there might be an attempt to take some political advantage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Consideration of work done. I mean, it's quite impressive as a kind of blooming of draft treaty activity in the short time span. But there has been no treaty until now. And that's also an important factor, which is part maybe of the caution. So at least one is expected quite soon, but at the same time there can be questioning about its meaning. But once again, the common characteristic is this insistence on verification, this search in the direction of inspection procedure, which is a rather new East-West feature. Even if I take a very technical point, I think that here a kind of signal has been given around Stockholm. I mean, the idea, and it has been practiced since there is quite recently this inspection done on with an American team, and so the procedure is already tested. At the same time, we could see that it came out as an important factor in the chemical weapon negotiation with important moves from the Soviet side, presented by Foreign Minister Shevardnadze himself coming to Geneva to present this new element of the Soviet position. And we see now that the verification point remains a very important feature and the inspection procedure of the INF agreement. So, I mean, something is crossing the fields. That doesn't mean all these negotiations are interrelated, but I think it's worth noticing this increase in very substantial drafting activity, and at the same time, this kind of common element you can see here and there influencing each other. It's because there has been an East-West agreement in Stockholm on inspection and challenge inspection that it became a growing point of interest in the chemical area, because it's a key point of any future chemical negotiation. And at the same time, I mean, the question of inspection and verification in INF agreement has been an enormous one, and in many aspects helped to draw the 100 warheads, Asian warheads question, because it would simplify constantly the whole thing. So I think this is an interesting feature of this year. But at the same time, another point I would note is the considerable amount of work which has been done by governments towards public opinion, and maybe too much in certain aspects. Because there's been a lot of talk at the same time, and sometimes misleading, where I think you can understand this sense of caution I noticed. We have heard in Reykjavik, let's drop 50% of strategic weapons. An enormous step in many aspects, because it's really something new. At the same time, you have to remember that 50% of the strategic force would mean the ceilings of 78. I mean, just coming back from 87 to 78, that is 50%. Still, it's very important. But then, second remark, what has taken place since 1 year is not working on this 50% reduction. It has been working on INF, which is far less, which is another field of priority. I could develop in many aspects. Great move on Soviet side on channel inspection, but now we are going closer on chemical weapons. We don't know what happens or is about the chemical stocks of the Soviet Union. It's purely unknown. No figure, no dimension, no composition. At the same time, there has been a Soviet move. I could take many other aspects. I don't want to be long. I just want to say there is a kind of viscosity in real security consideration with the over-activity in public statement and public diplomacy. I mean, here there was an very interesting reference, which is a usual one by Mrs. Lewis, about beauty contest. I think of another comparison. I have the feeling that on East-West relation, we have had a kind of hyperactivity of future markets, like in stock markets. I mean, there is not enough, maybe until now, not enough exchange in real goods, but a lot in future. Everybody is selling or buying in the future, but the idea when the clock stops and you begin to count down and see who is giving what or buying what or selling what. I mean, this has not come. And I'm not sure that it's an American-Soviet summit which will mean something there. It's much more, it must go much further, because an American summit will be taken, a Soviet-American summit will be taken again with public diplomacy, with statesmen, with good luck, with understandings, with Geneva, atmospherics and so on. And that is important, and we need that. But this will not make the kind of real departure we feel is possible. So I think that here, the very difficulty of moving, of going beyond this kind of initial step, which can be registered for the 86, 87 on the whole, has an enormous way and step to be done, still to be confirmed, and really come to change in structures. So I think that we are in many aspects in the transition phase. I will not dwell upon the nature of the Soviet system and the evolution of the Soviet system. I think Dr. Novak's description of this dual move on the eastern side of modernization inside and negotiation outside is very impressive and very good summarization of what is really at stake right now and the kind of perception which can exist on the eastern side and the feeling one can see in many speeches of Gorbachev or other leaders, I mean, that opening itself is not a sign of weakness, otherwise it will kill the whole thing. And there, I think that we have to integrate that, and it's a very, very interesting factor. I would just add two things. One, I think that on the European countries' side, there is a greater feeling that beyond specific agreements, or as Mr. Zipper said, beyond some specific arms control point, I mean, the feel that what we are working at is a much more deep-rooted historical movement of an integrated character, which is not only resting on arms control, which is resting on changes in society, in restoring a historical relationship, which encompasses much wider things. And this, of course, comes up very much in Vienna right now. I mean, and this is the whole meaning of the CSC process. The other consideration looks absolutely exotic, but at the same time, I think has to be taken into account, which is, of course, the Persian-Arabic Gulf crisis, where the discussion, the disconnection with East-West has been considerable until now. I mean, in regional terms, the equivalent of the World War I has been taking place in 7 years. And this has been almost completely disconnected from East-West relations during the last 7 years, almost. And now suddenly, I mean, things come to a certain limit for many aspects and involve plenty of security consideration of the highest importance. And I think this cannot be forgotten when one tries to evaluate the East-West year, I would say. My just final point would be to say that we have gone a good lot of way in 1 year. It has been a very busy year, but it's a very, it keeps a very volatile character. And the need for confirmation and consolidation of deep trends will need not only, and I come back to what I said, the Soviet American factor. I think it's a much more deep-rooted investment where the fundamental logic of the CSC, I would say, is that, I mean, all Western European countries, Eastern European countries, and other powers are involved in the European security process. This is the job of everybody, and not only of the countries. Most clearly, and sorry to have been long.
So, well, now we've done that. Well, let's go on and get a 50% reduction in strategic arms, and Pierre Morel helpfully points out that it only takes us back 8 years. And you get kind of a momentum created. And I, for one, am very worried about momentums. Because one of the problems about arms control is that it's extremely complicated and does not lend itself very easily to simple solutions. I happen to be involved in the American government when we thought of the zero option in the context of INF. Unfortunately for us, it wasn't adopted. And when it finally was adopted, by the other guy that is, we began to realize how complicated it was. You know, it's very, very complicated doing arms control agreements, and doing them fast is an excellent way of getting them wrong. And I'm kind of concerned about the euphoria created by an INF agreement and a summit. Now, I suppose what's desirable about it is that since we're having elections in the United States next year, we're bound to lose a couple of years afterwards anyway, while the new American administration reinvents the wheel, so we're probably going to be saved. But to take the case in which we weren't saved, I would be very worried about getting pushed into other arms control agreements, both as an American. And I think the European participants in the Vienna talks, the next Vienna talks, whatever you want to call them, Summit MBFR, will also find it a bit more complicated than they think. You know, it's very easy when things are going well to say of the Americans and the Russians, let's you and him eliminate some arms. It's very much more complicated when you actually discover that it's your arms that are going to have to be eliminated. And about it is if you get it wrong, you know, it's not like making a decision on the stock market. If you get that wrong, well, you lose a lot of money. But if you get your decision on arms control wrong, you kind of doing all sorts of complicated things to your security. So I, for one, would just hope that before we bask in the era of good feeling that's going to be created by Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. Reagan presumably signing an agreement, we take a fair amount of time, all of us, and our governments, and our people, and our institutes like this one, and think about what we really want to do next. Sure, it would be a shame to lose the momentum, but what I equally believe be even more of a shame to rush into quickly.
The movement, and I'm not saying whether it's constructive or negative movement, but that something has happened. I think there are basically three really factors. The first one, and I think the Western participants have to face this squarely, the reason for why things have started to change is in fact what's happened in the Soviet Union, and to some extent what's happening in Eastern Europe as well. Regardless of how much this goes beyond rhetoric and so forth, I, for one, personally believe that, and it was a very good article by Abe Rosenberg the other day in the Tribune about that there's a hell of a lot more going on below the surface there than most in the West are willing to admit. Now, whether some of it's positive from the point of view of the West and not is something else. But most of the movement has come from either proposals, whether they're good or bad, or changes within the Soviet Union. And the West has largely reacted to these, and reacted, in my view, rather ineptly. And that is part. The second factor that's different, is the end of the Reagan era. And here I would point to three very obvious things that have happened. November elections, in which the Democrats regained the Senate. Iran-Gate combined with that, which has undermined the president's prestige, as well as the basic deflected attention from both foreign and domestic policies. And thirdly, the president's lame duck status. I think, in a few more months, you're going to be into the silly season. If you're not already in it already in the United States. It's going to be very hard to do very much. You may have an INF agreement, but that is about all, and then we will be waiting to see what the next administration does. And the fact that you are towards the end of this era, with a great deal of uncertainty, what American policy not only is now going to be in the last year and a half, if there's any policy at all, but what you're going to have in the future. But you've had a turn to the center. You've seen it on arms control. You've seen it recently in what's happened in Latin America, in part because of the structural changes in American domestic politics that I mentioned earlier. The third thing is the INF agreement. I don't want to argue the pros and cons of this, but it seems to me very clear that this was a product of domestic politics, by and large, in both countries. It's going to happen, and it's going to happen, and it was clear back in March and April, or it was clear in April when Schultz went to Moscow and basically made positive utterances about double zero. And it was clear then that the West Germans were going to have to back down. And it was clear, quite frankly, that what happened a few days ago and what Kohl said was also going to have to happen, because the West Germans basically had very little choice in this. But what I think is significant is not whether it's 5% or 10%. I think it's totally irrelevant. The politics of this, however, are extremely important. And the fact is that when this agreement goes through, NATO is going to face a very, very difficult situation. And the West Germans in particular are going to face a very difficult situation. And the whole issue of tactical nuclear weapons and its linkage to the conventional balance, and the whole issue of NATO strategy is being opened up, and will be opened up, in my view, with a vengeance. You'll have a new debate on NATO strategy, very similar to the one that you had from 60 to 67 on flexible response. I have no idea where that's going to come out, but I think that this is going to be an extremely critical period, and the next couple of years are going to be very, very important. As I said, just to end, that there is a lot going on. It hasn't gelled yet, but it's going to have profound significance for the internal policies some countries and for the foreign policy. And this includes the United States, how the United States is going to deal with the debt question. I don't want to get into this, and I'm an expert on it, but it's going to impact tremendously defense policy. It's going to impact SDI, and it's going to have an impact on what the United States does on conventional forces. And that's all going to feed into a debate, basically, on where NATO is going to go and how it's going to maintain a strategy without a lot of the nuclear weapons. And you can argue that, well, there are still 4,000 nuclear weapons, but there aren't going to be 4,000 tactical nuclear weapons in a couple of years from now. And there just can't be. And there are a lot of West Germans who aren't going to want them there. And it's inevitable that the issue of tactical nuclear weapons and conventional forces is going to move to the center. It's already moving there. It's going to move there in the next couple of years. And again, I would emphasize, where are the initiatives coming from? They're coming from the East. You may not like them, many of the people in the don't. You may not feel they're very good. That's where the initiative is coming from. That's where the ideas are being put forward. In the West, up until now, has basically been simply sitting there and reacting. And if that continues, it will be a very dynamic situation.
Against to the stagnation, certain stagnation in East-West relationship due to the some traditional thinking on East-West relations. And this thinking was based on quite well recognized problems and issues, which now are under, say, re-evaluation. It was said that Gorbachev's policy influenced a lot and is going to influence the East-West relations, but I think that we should see this influence in a sense that perhaps the policy of Gorbachev is like a catalyst which influences East-West relations in many dimensions. And it influenced not only the general state of East-West relations, but also East-East relationship, West-West relationship, and of course East-West relations at the local level.
Thankful raise this point. Of course, we are in a period of change. Of course, we have many problems. Of course, we have these very important military problems. But I will say that we are now in a moment of crisis because the problems are political. The problem is the future of Europe. Are we ready to end the post-war period of Europe? This is a problem in the East and in the West. Are we ready to establish new political and economic relations in Europe? And I think that tomorrow...
say, honestly, I truly respect very deeply. And that maybe sounds terrible, but Jim and I go back a number of years, back when I was doing the Middle East and other assorted things, and I came to know him and to deal with him and to respect him immensely. And it's a great honor for me personally that Jim has agreed to come down and be with us and to speak to us. The phone call he had a little earlier tonight was, in his words, quote, from someone more powerful, more important than Gorbachev. Now, I'm going to ask if anybody here, other than these two tables, which know, if anybody here understands who that was. Catherine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, who is his ultimate boss. So I think that gives a little insight into the speaker. He thinks Catherine Graham is more powerful than Gorbachev. I guess for you, Jim, I guess for you, he is. But anyway, it shows the power of the Washington Post to find a basement of a 1,000-year-old priory in Delaware to track someone down. Jim is a Pulitzer Prize winner. He has had a tremendous track record in a very short period of time with the Washington Post. He is currently based in Paris, where he is, correct me, Jim, associate editor, and you're something of foreign correspondent, chief foreign correspondent of the Washington Post, based out of Paris, which was the city that he loves and wanted very much with his family to be in. Unfortunately, he didn't bring his other half, which is sad, for a reason that that Karen and I will someday know about too. It has to do with children and other assorted family issues. But we're very glad. We asked Jim to speak tonight about I forget the exact topic, but something to do with Gorbachev and his challenge to the West. Is that right? Is that right?
I should apologize, I guess, for violating your no-tie dictum. You know, during one stage of the Iranian Revolution, people in Iran were divided in two categories. There were the turbans, that is the traditional mullahs, the clerics, and the technocrats who were in ties. And those of us who stayed with the ties tonight should remember what happened to those people in Iran. An hour and a half to deliver those 15 minutes of value. And I've always thought since then that the ideal situation would be the reverse of that. Now, I don't think I'm going to accomplish that tonight. I don't think I'm going to succeed, but I wanted you to know where I started from and what my ideal was. Give you some idea of what we can try to do here. And as John said, perhaps these remarks will serve to spur discussion and to get some good question and answer sessions going either tonight or tomorrow. Most of you probably think that I'm pinch hitting for Joe Nye, who was supposed to speak here tonight. That's a very clever cover story that John Rose has concocted because his original ambition was to have Prime Minister Jacques Chirac speak. And Chirac had agreed. But that was before he found out that KFM, the recently privatized channel, was showing Madonna concerts. That's another reason to be brief. It starts in exactly 15 minutes. Go out and catch the set. You've already missed Michael Jackson's video, which is called Video Clip here, which was broadcast tonight on French television. Yep, sorry. They don't, you know. But it's a pleasure to be here and to share a few ideas and insights that come primarily from two trips that I made in July, one to Washington and then immediately to Moscow. And after spending nearly 22 years at the Washington Post, I never thought the day would come when I would want to swap that perhaps to be a staffer for Merdeka magazine of Indonesia. But that day did come late in July in Moscow when I had gone there in part to help promote the idea of an interview with Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. And it was in fact Merdeka that got the interview in July. That's part of the reason why I've urged the United States now to join ASEAN, because I'm convinced that this incident of Gorbachev giving the interview to an Indonesian journal on the anniversary of the Vladivostok speech was not an accident, as they say in Moscow. He chose a country that is not only a member of ASEAN, a very important economic grouping in Southeast Asia, but also also a country with a large population base, the largest population base in ASEAN, and the most important economic base, and a foreign policy that is not in conflict with Soviet Union goals in Asia. In other words, it was quite a considered choice and reflects what I think is the most substantial challenge that Gorbachev is posing to us in foreign policy by introducing this element of realism and new thinking and concentrating Soviet efforts on important countries and important areas rather than spending time in marginal situations where some quick gain might be picked up but really not translated into anything. I cite this example, masochistic example, coming in second really in journalistic competition because the journalistic competition that's going on right now in Moscow, it's underway right now, also serves to illustrate the topic of the evening, I think, in several ways. It centers on two aspects. One is that journalists, particularly American journalists, are competing furiously right now to try to obtain an interview with Gorbachev as part of the lead into what we expect to be a Soviet-American summit later in the year. It's a matter of individual and corporate prestige as well as service to our readers. The second element of the competition is an effort to figure out if Gorbachev is for real. And I guess that's really the topic that we're looking at in this conference. For real, in the sense of what this visionary language that he often uses, and the rather startling changes that he proposes in security policies, in economic policies, and in foreign policies, can be, and are meant to be, translated into reality. And some U.S. publications are even setting a deadline for answering this question of whether Gorbachev is real. There are special supplements, special editions being planned for November 7th, the 70th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. I suppose others of us will try to ponder this question for a good bit longer, because I don't think we're going to come up with a nice, neat answer by November 7th. I think, in fact, that it's quite an accomplishment for Gorbachev that after nearly 2.5 years in power, we're still asking ourselves this question. It demonstrates a certain flair for ambiguity that has not always been characteristic of Soviet leadership. The basic question challenge remains, what is Gorbachev up to and what do we do about it? I realize that there are some who hold that this uncertainty in the West about what Gorbachev is up to actually reflects a precarious position, a weakness, possibility that his reforms will either backfire or that they might work too well, and either way provoke the old miners to oust him. My own view is that that's wishful thinking by those who feel uneasy with the nature and direction and the pace of the change that Gorbachev has actually demanded within the Soviet Union and indeed within the communist world. I think the ability that he showed in the spring to place his own man at the head of the Soviet military establishment and to elevate his ally Yakovlev to the Politburo demonstrates quite clearly that he is in control of the Politburo and will be able to use the special party conference that he's called to get complete control of the Central Committee. Just before traveling to Moscow, as I mentioned, I was in Washington, and I concluded from that vision that the view that I just stated is shared by the senior policymakers in the Reagan administration.
Must be wrong.
Despite that possibility, which I have to concede. Many of them seem to think that Gorbachev has indeed turned a corner, in contrast to the view of 6 months to a year ago by these same policymakers. He's no longer seen as flailing. He's no longer seen as putting out arms control proposal after arms control proposal because of weakness, but because he has a strategy, because he has a design. They have concluded that he will be at the helm for some time to come, and that he has shown skill in manipulating the helm. And that the American challenge has become to develop strategies based on these assumptions of a long-term, forceful, and quite intelligent Soviet leader who is going to survive. I think there are now signs, and again, I think there are many here who will probably take the occasion to disagree with this, and I encourage them to do so. But I think there are now signs that the Reagan administration, at least at the level of the officials who portrayed Soviet foreign policy as having become much more realistic, is trying to design long-term policies to meet that. It's rather paradoxical in the final year in which the administration is so weakened at home, that this should happen. But I think that this message that the Soviet Union is now concentrating on Kuwait in the Middle East rather than South Yemen or the PLO, looking at Mexico as being much more important in Central America than Cuba or Nicaragua, has gotten through, and that we can no longer rely on inaction or on tactical maneuvering that would bring us some advantage. I think, as Senator Sam Nunn has said, we finally gotten to the point where we realize that we have to think through proposals, our proposals, which the Soviet may wind up accepting. I think also there's a particular approach that the administration is developing to Europe now that I'll come back to, but I think is extremely important. So I would argue that Gorbachev's diplomatic challenge to American policy is long-term, is pragmatic, and in some areas subtle to ambiguous. That has sunk in Washington, where the new thinking has been met for too long with old thinking. The message that I received most frequently and most ardently when I was in Moscow 6 weeks ago from Soviet officials, some of whom are in a position to know what Gorbachev is thinking, was that he aims with these policies to transform the psychology of American-Soviet relations. In the phrase of one Soviet official, we intend to deprive you of the bogeyman advantage, that is, the image of bellicose Soviet Union that carries out a nuclear buildup, that carries out expansion into Afghanistan, that stood ready to crush the solidarity movement in Poland if necessary. That is, the Soviet Union that helped elect Ronald Reagan and helped him get funding for an unprecedented peacetime military buildup, helped him launch a new activism in supporting guerrillas in Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and Angola. I think no part of the Gorbachev challenge is clearer than that. It is to undermine the Western view of the Soviet threat, to encourage questions like those that I think are now being asked quite seriously. What would happen if one day the Pentagon, the CIA, and Jesse Helms all woke up and found American public opinion, or a large part of it, no longer believed in the Soviet threat? Another question is even more pressing, I think. That is, what happens if European publics come to a different view of the Soviet threat than the American public? This is the vital area of challenge for us and for him. For us in probing to find out if he is, as the question puts it, for real. This idea of changing the psychology of U.S.-Soviet relations and of depriving American politicians of the Soviet threat is a momentous ambition. But I would say that Gorbachev has made enough progress to encourage President Reagan to recall last week, during a speech that he delivered by television to Soviet and American delegates to the Chautauqua Conference, Reagan felt compelled to remind us that it is vital that Western reporters and editors keep the real record of these negotiations in mind. He was talking specifically about the INF negotiations, but I think he meant arms control negotiations in general as well. Well, this admonition to us ink-stained wretches of the West really is remarkable. It would not have been necessary to try to remember, or to tell us to try to remember who the real peacemaker in the world is during the time of Andropov, or Cheremenko, or even the late 1970s model of Brezhnev. I think it is in this Chautauqua speech by President Reagan that there are signals that the administration is finally coming to terms with the Gorbachev challenge and is ready to put forward a more forthcoming, realistic, and cost-conscious foreign policy. Cost in opportunity terms, not dollar terms, and with the major proviso that this probably does not include at this point SDI. Now, many of my colleagues, as one suggestion, or one comment has already suggested, are likely to attribute this to political troubles of the administration and the desire to escape them or perhaps eclipse them, rather than a solid and firm realization of what Gorbachev is about and what the nature of the challenge that he presents to us. But I think we are beginning to see in this speech a response to the diplomatic challenge. The Soviet delegates who reacted so negatively to the speech did not, in my view, listen closely enough to the very un-Reagan-like nuances. I urge a careful reading of Chautauqua's speech, and I think there is something to be built on a phrase like this one, coming from Ronald Reagan's speechwriters. We are also seeing a Soviet leadership that appears more willing to address the problems that have divided East and West for so long, and to seek agreements based on mutual benefits, particularly when that phrase is followed by this hopeful formulation. Perhaps then we may finally progress beyond the post-war standoff in Europe, is what he meant. And he used the shorthand, of course, that Americans used of Yalta. I think the focus that this speech provides on Europe as the place in the final year of Reagan's term, that effective power, really, for a final year, as a place where the reordering of American-Soviet relations could begin, is very important and worth considering. Now, I haven't touched on the question of the economic reforms, which of course are very important, particularly for Eastern Europe. I think that we'll get a chance to see a good bit more about how this reordering might go about from Mr. Honecker's visit to Bonn. I think we might profitably discuss either this evening or the next day the question of Gorbachev's references in the June speech to the Central Committee about the need for deeper integration between Soviet and Eastern Europe economies, and whether or not this is going to work against the two-decade-old efforts by the West and the unspoken efforts by many Eastern European countries to move closer to the West through the economic formulas. I think this represents something of a potential change. We have not also talked here tonight yet about the INF Treaty, but that is obviously the cornerstone of this new effort to reorder American-Soviet relations in Europe. And perhaps that's one area we might want to touch on. But since now I'm in danger of having delivered less than 15 minutes of value and more time than that, I think I better stop. Thank you. Should indeed be a very serious and specific step in conventional arms control that addresses not only the question of balance of U.S.-Soviet forces, NATO Warsaw Pact forces, but also the Soviet relationship with Eastern Europe, as well as the Soviet economic motor that you've described for change. I think that's where he has to go next. I think he has to be very serious, very specific, and very wide-ranging if he's going to bring off all of his programs. I think it's the key.
Please let me differentiate. I think the analysis is correct. I don't necessarily think the administration thinks that, and I wish that they did. I have seen no, and maybe there has been a change in the last several months. What has struck me is that that analysis was not the analysis that the administration was making several months ago, and that it was very hard to convince some people in rather high places, and in fact, Gorbachev might be serious, that you might have to deal with this guy for the next 5, 6, 7 years, and that there might even be opportunities that ought to be exploited. And I suspect that we were talking to some of the same people. And my own sense is, to the extent that the administration's views have changed, it has been because of domestic pressures, and because there is an election coming up in which the Republican Party wants to do well, in which arms control agreement is important, and so forth. But the problem is that that is a kind of superficial analysis, and that the basic analysis of what's going on in the Soviet Union is not very, very much different. And if they had been doing that type of analysis, I think the policy towards the Soviet Union would have explored certain opportunities much earlier than they did. So what I would like to do in posing a question to you is, can I draw you out on why you think the administration all of a sudden has really changed its basic analysis, not its tactics, where I would agree, yes, tactics for domestic political reasons, Iran, shift in the Senate, lots of things like that. But why you feel that there's a different analysis that will perhaps transcend this administration and would be carried out by whatever administration would follow?
Yeah, the elevation of Yazov and the ease with which that was accomplished, and then the central, Politburo meeting, Central Committee meeting, Politburo election in June were vital to this change. I know, for example, that there were two competing intelligent analyses of the meaning of Yazov's elevation in Washington. One view being that Gorbachev knew very well what he was doing, that this would go very easily, turned out to be the right one. It was overnight analysis. The other overnight analysis was another example of Gorbachev playing about not knowing what he was doing. The people who made that analysis got burned. Pretty evident that they were wrong. Even they now acknowledge it. And that's the last time, and here you get into bureaucratic politics, that somebody now covers their flank on that kind of analysis. So you're not hearing as much within the State Department. And I think the agency's analysis was pretty good in this case. So I think the Yazov case and the June meeting both were instrumental in reshaping thinking of a lot of people who, I think, in the atmosphere in Washington today, have a freer hand on this than they did 6 months ago. And here you get to, I think, some of the effect of distraction. Some of the previous impediments and other things back to departure.
Joe, isolated away, reading a lot of the Soviet military literature that I've never had a chance to do during the course of the last year. And since Yazov has been named, it is absolutely incredible what's turning up in the military press and in the military journals and so forth. I can't get anybody to read it. Nobody seems to be reading this stuff. I wasn't reading it myself until I happened to have had some free time to do it. But I have to say that I had some assumptions and sort of hypotheses that something was going on. And I wanted to try to see whether that was the case. And I happened to have access to material that I didn't have classified, but nonetheless that I did not report. But I can tell you that, middle of July, that's 6 weeks after Matthias Rust and Yazov and so forth, very few people were willing to concede that anything was going on within the military, that this had that much of a significance. And therefore, I hope that you are right. And I have seen nobody writing about some of the things that are coming out in the military literature and some of the associated literature now that were just inconceivable even 3 months ago. But nobody seems to be taking very much notice.
Steve, can you give an example of what you
Well, I'll give you a good example, and I think Alan, I understand that Alan's read this, it's not in the military literature now, but there's a new article by Nemo, by Kokoshny, on the Battle of, 90%, no, but it's in Nemo, no, but it's in Nemo, the journal of Nemo, in the Bureau of It's 90% on the Battle of Kursk, but it deals essentially, tries to use this as an example of trying to show the importance of defense and how this has been underestimated in the past. And there are two other important aspects of it. The first part is where Kokoshny says, and he's a civilian analyst, but nonetheless not unimportant, he's the deputy director of the USA Institute, that this whole issue of military doctrine will require a rethinking among the professional military, and particularly that the whole idea of the offensive as the key to victory will have to be rethought and will require reach changes in military planning and force structure. Now, whether they do that or not is a different thing. You're talking about rhetoric. But the fact that now, all of a sudden, that's being talked about. In the military literature, several months before, a couple of articles, again, about the use of defense and the importance of defense in World War II. You would never have found in Soviet military literature anybody who could have come out and said that defense was really important and that it had been underestimated and Stalin and his generals hadn't understood this and so forth. One small example. You can find letters coming into Krasnaya Zvezda, things I had no idea. Just talking about all of the things that are wrong with the military, lack of discipline, how the officers are trained, this, that, and the other thing. We've got to be more open. We've got to admit that we've made mistakes, that we didn't understand. All this type of thing. And you can look back and literally the whole issue of perestroika before Yazov came to power was simply not, or very, it was in the military literature, but in a very superficial way. You can look at articles by Lusha, the first deputy defense minister, in June, which probably went to press in April, in which perestroika isn't even mentioned. And then 2 months later in Mishman and articles in which it's mentioned, in which all the kind of Gorbachev buzzwords are all in there. And something's happening. But, you know, when you start talking about this, people are saying, well, this isn't really, either they aren't looking at it, I don't know, I certainly wasn't, so I can. But there is something going on, and one has to say that something has happened, maybe it's over the last few months. How far that will go, whether that rhetoric about doctrine is serious or not, will remain to be seen and will have to be tested. My only point is, I think that it should be tested, and in my discussions, I couldn't find very many people that thought that there was much really worth going on in any seriousness.
These articles have been called to my attention, in fact, by State Department people. There are people in the State Department who are watching. There's a resistance on, usually it's the articles about drunkenness and sloth in the military and all of that, the need for perestroika and that sense. There's a real resistance that I don't quite understand to admitting that Soviet doctrine needed changing. That is an area that I would say my comments would not come. And I don't quite understand that. I know Flora has written some very good columns on this point, the need to change that.
Not just the need, the refusal to look at it.
The refusal to look at it. You're absolutely right. It's the one area that I would say that there's still a surprising resistance of. I saw Bernie Rogers in May just before he left, and he floated again the idea of how he would have liked to have sat down with Kulikov and talked about it.
They've refused to do it.
They refused to do it. But the military man wants to do it.
Yeah, okay. I mean, there you get the offer. You don't always say, well, actually, you know, it was very dangerous. We don't want to do this, and so forth.
I mean, perhaps there are people here who would like to talk about the inter-alliance politics of that and the civilian military politics of that on our side. We probably have very little to do with Soviet American politics. My sense.
Besides, the INF solution is towards the US. We feel that this is also, if not more, the what we look at. So, very simple question. What is, in your view, Gorbachev's politics towards
If I heard this, because I really do think the Honecker trip, which we don't know the results of yet, will tell us a lot about this question. And give us some clearer view into the heart of the European questions, the German problem. Again, this is something that I'm sure is not universally shared in this room, and I want to hear people talk about this. But it seems to me that when Gorbachev tells von Weizsäcker, as he did in May, that he has no intention of proposing a reunification of Germany, that he's telling the truth. That it was never his intention. That the Honecker trip seems to me to be the final proof of that. That we are talking about accepting the demise of the fiction of a German nation, a united German nation in the lifetime of anybody who is alive today. And that we are accepting the existence of the two countries, the two states. My own view of Gorbachev's policy toward Europe is that it's much less based on alliance splitting and creating turmoil within the alliance than is generally assumed. And I think he's not unhappy if that happens, but the things that drive his policies are to him much more important than that he correctly sees as peripheral and really unobtainable for him through his own policies. I don't know if that's sufficient. I'll try to develop a little more if you want to guide me as to where you think we should.
Yeah, well, yes, this is a part of the answer, since you mentioned this which is more than a relationship, but a humility.
Sort of range, intermediate range forces. To use a ridiculous lexicon. With the inclusion of those systems, means that Gorbachev is giving up a clear military advantage for political gain. That political gain is only delivered later, and that INF is valuable both for the United States and for Western Europe, precisely because it will enable us to take probe, to see what that next step is, and to see if Gorbachev is for real on security policy. That would be the answer to that.
That's good. So if I will have just one comment, I think the basic thrust of the argument was, I think, and I would agree with you, not only 100 but 150%, is that the main concern of the Gorbachev administration in Russia is to try to build down the classical image of Russia as a boogeyman in Western Europe. I think that basically is a concern because that will have to do with trying to influence the Western European defense concept, which has been a central tenet of, that's the way I see it, of all the Soviet Russian armed proposals over the last 25 years. Now, if you take the question of military doctrines, I think we need to analyze the Soviet concept of military doctrines very, very hard. I would agree that the basic consideration, again, of the Soviet Union proposal to introduce the element of discussion of a military doctrine thing is basically to use the military doctrine concept again as a leverage to reduce the Western traditional image of the Soviet Union as part of the
influence of Gorbachev's policy on East European countries and also of American policy toward Eastern Europe.
It's an area that I feel very confident in respond to. I made a brief mention of the fact that I was intrigued by what Gorbachev means by deeper integration of East European and Soviet economies, and what the political implications of that are for the kind of thing that Hungary's been doing, that the United States has tried to, in fact, Democratic and Republican administrations have tried to encourage through differentiation policy. And it's very included, and I think it may well be included Gorbachev, given all the things he's got to get into line at home. It does seem clear that he very much wants to emphasize Soviet interest. This may present a problem for Europe. I think ultimately it presents a problem for the United States in trying to devise policies that take into account the specific nature of each country and encourage the idea of the specific nature of each European. Very inadequate answer to your question, but partly based on my ignorance and partly because I think the situation is so murky.
To imagine that, let's talk about U.S.-Soviet relations. What kind of relationship would you like to see the United States have with the Soviet Union, let's say 5 to 10 years ago? So what should we be aiming at in terms of the type of relationship we should want to have with the Soviets?
Put that question to a Soviet official in Moscow in July, and his answer rather startled me. He said, we wish every other foreign country would look at our relationship with India. That's the model for all countries should have the same attitude, the same relationship with the Soviet Union and India. I don't think we're going to get there. I don't think that's in the cards. They also talk about going back or creating something that is not called détente but resembles very much a period of the early 1970s. And clearly that idea is being played with in Moscow. I suppose in the short term, 3 years, 5 years, that's as much as we can hope for. Beyond that, I think it's going to be transformed, if it's going to be transformed through Eastern Europe, through the Soviet definition of what its interests are and what its abilities are to have a normal relationship, that is, without the Red Army in Eastern Europe. Will define the Soviet view toward the rest of the world and toward the United States. Probably a little bit of heresy, particularly in this group.
Some answer, and this is of course open to discussion. The first part is an attempt to put the conventional arms control now in perspective as within the whole strategic environment. What is changing, what has not changed. NATO is taken up, and therefore not yet dead. There is a leading in CSC, not only from the map, one could recall that in Madrid already, the mandate of Madrid, the CDE, Conference on Disarmament in Europe, the notion of conventional disarmament was there.
On the west side and for the East-West relations. I think we should divide the theme into two parts. One is the conventional, and that's the theme, and the other is the perspective of change in between to the conventional capabilities. If we had, for example,
it seems to me a view of the imagination, and to present the idea that after the INF agreement or after any kind of agreement, we will have now in Europe a new situation with a new emphasis on the conventional weapons and a lessening of importance of the nuclear deterrence. And more, you open the door to this kind of proposal of negotiation, including tactical nuclear weapons and conventional weapons, and favorizing a confusion between both kind of weapon, saying that now with the new technology we have conventional weapons with the same meaning and the same destructive powers as nuclear weapons and so on. So it seems to me that it's not the best starting point to say now we have a banalization of the nuclear arsenal, the nuclear deterrence doesn't mean something, flexible response doesn't exist anymore, and because of the no early first years theory, and obviously there is
related to the new policy of the Soviet Union. I think that what is dangerous, it is the development of the various concepts of the use of conventional weapons now. And let me say that one thing that has been overlooked in the West, at least looking from our perspective, that speaking all the time about the offensive posture of the Warsaw Pact, it is being overlooked the evolution in the West, which in 2-3 years will make the use of conventional weapons much more offensive than it was until now. Because if you are 800,
the intention behind Folkfire and the ODL and back, all of that different scope and intention is, of course, basically geared towards the concept of trying to fend off what we call the second or third echelon, because instead of NATO thinking, NATO is in a situation where NATO forces are being attacked by very quick, fast-moving first echelon groups, reinforced on the late stages, on second and third echelons. And the fourth concept here, of course, is basically geared as a very defensive concept to break that particular situation. And I just wanted to stress this in the military thinking.
Conventional arms control, with regard to the relationship between conventional weapons and nuclear weapons, and I think that is very, very important to keep that in mind. And the central question seems to to be, how can we have conventional arms control if we are still uncertain as to how the latest possible arms control agreement on nuclear forces relates to the way we are going to think about conventional forces. And I don't think we can take the step of talking about how we see the conventional problem developing and evolving unless we're quite sure what the role of the nuclear weapons are going to be in Europe. And I think we really need to talk about this.
If I had to answer very quickly this question, I would say that nothing has changed, not yet. If the INF agreement is yet to be signed, when signed, it has to be ratified. And I'm not so sure it would be an easy task to accomplish in the US Senate. Then there is a 5-year period to be implemented. And in this 5 years, if just as an example, take what happened between the beginning and the end of the Carter administration. So in 5 years, before we implement what is now seems to be contained in the agreement, I mean everything implemented. The whole atmosphere of the East-West relation can turn upside down. And this is a very easy. And then again, all the military programs underway on both sides, despite so many talks, are still there. I mean, the deployment plan of Cruise and Pershing is underway. I mean, 3/5 of INF are under development right now in Europe.
Continue to conduct a costly, expensive policy in the third world. What he has more specifically in mind, because if there is a dissociation with the developing of post-modern armaments program, and without to take the Department papers, in page 6, it is said in Eastern Europe is going to get several questions.
Because I think it's very interesting to consider the possibilities of changes in Eastern Europe domestically. Even with a special emphasis on just the domestic problems, disregarding East-West context, because ultimately it will affect East-West context anyway. Now, because the Soviet Union is, I would say, the ultimate independent variable in this picture. And what's happening, even in a country like Hungary, where the reform is pushed far away, still there is one very serious problem, and it is how the rest of the socialist community will react on the impact of the reforms.
His conclusion, which seemed to be that it's a bad thing to let all the initiatives come from the East. I don't see that it's bad. On the contrary, I think it's fine.
Now, American analysts try to put the emphasis on East European or Soviet domestic developments and changes. They are less.
Let me just start out with the positive developments in the negotiations and arms control. We should really consider the INF agreement that it's probably not overestimating it, but still it is a historic opportunity which should be grasped for the aim of giving East-West relations a fundamentally new, positive, and durable direction, in the sense of really having some kind of a cooperative security system, although I know that this is a very dangerous term that has been used from impatient. Maybe that is what Joe meant also by his fear of too much momentum. But certainly a step-by-step approach in taking initiatives from the east or the west would be very much in order. Very offhand definition, I would like to say that I understand it as a fundamental ideological antagonism that is then expressed in all kinds of threats, perceptions of threats, and counteractions. I feel that we're still in the final phase of Cold War. We cannot say that we're out of the Cold War yet, because there is the right rhetoric, there's the right thinking, but the right actions based on these statements are still largely missing, although there are some encouraging signs. I think one in the military field that is very encouraging is the ongoing inspection under the CEE agreement of Stockholm, and this is something that was quite inconceivable a few years ago, and so there is this possibility, besides of other elements like the acceptance of capitalist aspects by socialist countries, and so we are going in the right direction. We can say maybe we see the end of the tunnel.
An almost struggle for a new status quo in Europe, then I would hesitate to say that it's really over, because the very same terms are still existing, and that is the new interest in East European development. So that's a kind of background hope for some serious changes in the political status quo in Europe. I don't think that this this final thing is fully over. Now that gives a lot of political incentives and influences strategy making. So if we define it in such a broader term, I would say it's not over. If we define Cold War in the original meaning, then I think it's really over for a very long time, at least since the late 60s. And then the question is irrelevant. It is a question only because in the past decade we could see a détente and then a sharp deterioration in the Soviet relation, but not so much so the East-West relations in general. So I wouldn't say that there was a second World War, at least not in a general sense. There was a serious backlash in Soviet relations, that's all. And then the question will be better placed so that is this say second native of Soviet American relations over, and then I would say it's just
talking about were Cold War assumptions, and the question of how to get over these. I mean, the point Flora started, I think, was one of those, which was legitimate in the West, and that is this idea that the Eastern countries are held together by coercion and geographic history rather than other things. And one could argue the other, all kinds of these kinds of things.
It's not just the same as real. It's everyday life for people on both sides. And that remains. That, I assume, should be everybody's goal to overcome.
But despite these assumptions, now we have a new situation in which those assumptions might change. If the process goes in the right direction, it's as it always said yesterday, Gorbachev is for real. And as Europeans, I think that this is a very good moment. For the first time, the Pandora's box seems to be open. We are so used to thinking in terms of modest and so-called realistic goals that it is difficult for us to realize that maybe certain very large issues which we consider impossible to address now can be addressed. Western Europe, when we think of Europe, many times we don't think of Poland, or we think of Hungary. And it's very painful. So all these things, for the first time, we can think about. We can look at how they develop, what kind of effects Gorbachev's policies have on them.
Desirable reality
going to have the same meaning now and in the future. So it's somewhat artificial discussion. Obviously, if we consider the division of Europe as a point of reference to all those divisions, one may agree with such approach, but I would like to mention that the division we have just now is not the same division we had 10, 20 or 40 years ago. So it's division is very relative category, because in the European history for centuries, Europe was always divided and influenced by different powers, and I think that we look at the division of Europe just starting from 1945. So it's not the case. But it's my remark on this issue. I would like perhaps later to comment briefly on the question of Laura Ruiz. I also think that from a military point of view, the Soviet Union also is not to react to changes in East European countries like it was the case in the past. So what kind of new type of links Gorbachev had in mind? I think that his idea is to rationalize economic ties between the economical countries. And reading Soviet economic press just now, one may find the very right assessment that the expansion of links with the Western countries in the 70s, Hungary or Poland, was not only due to the willingness of the ruling people to expand links with the US just for political reasons. The expansion of economic relations with Western countries in the 70s was a reaction of smaller East European countries to the limited possibilities of commerce.
As the way of upgrading our own economies. So I see a contradiction there, and I was wondering what your view is.
Perhaps with the exception of Hungary and I don't know Czechia, but all other East European economies are very autarkic still. So the problem is to increase the growth of foreign exchange in the economy, and it will be going into direction to the west and to the east.
I expect in general amount that 70% of our trade or our economic ties are in the other socialist countries, and 30% is going to developing countries and capitalist countries. Will in general be the same. There might be some changes in percentages, but in general it will be for serious reasons. I think the economic ties we have developed are really important for our existence. It's not only trade, it's common productions to a certain extent, investments on the other side. So this isn't unnecessary for our economic development. But at the same time, I agree completely with what I said. At the same time, keeping and improving relations with the West are important as well for the well-being of the socialist countries. So I don't see it as an alternative concept, something which excludes each other. I see both trends will develop. And if I had to interpret the Soviet intentions, I think even they, although as was said before, they are in another position as great power, more independent than the others, even they probably see intra-bloc economic relations and improved ties with the West as something which is compatible and which has to work together.
How is restructuring